Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual summit. Today, we're honored to have Jen, Christian, and Abigail with us. They're going to do their own introductions and tell you a little bit about themselves. Just as a reminder, everybody's muted and your videos are turned off. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will try to get to them after the presentation. I also just wanted to say to anybody who is signed up tomorrow for Grace Kuhn's presentation, she had a family emergency. Very sorry, but we have to cancel that presentation and we are working on rescheduling it. So I'm going to turn this all over to Jen, Christian, and Abigail now. And thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about some academic research we've been doing. And after I introduce our team, I'm going to just situate you a little bit in terms of how this kind of a research project and research presentation works. But first, my name is Jen Britton, and I am a wild horse photographer. I'm an admin with Wild Horse Photography Collective. Tag us, #WildHorsePC. During the day, I work at Drexel University, where I manage our climate sustainability strategy for the institution. Let me take it to Christian here.
Hi, I am primarily, of course, Jennifer's husband. My day job is to be a political scientist at Drexel University, where I teach environmental politics and research methods. And a lot of my recent work has been in a field called human-animal studies, which sort of is interested in the intersection of humans and non-humans, right? What happens politically when animals meet people in all sorts of contexts. And this ongoing collaboration with Jen around wild horse politics and governance kept us busy, for 3 or 4 years now, right?
2018 is when we published our first one.
Oh, time flies. Okay.
Yeah.
Not getting out of here any younger. So that's what I do. I also do a little bit of wildlife photography, and we'll point the finger at Abigail.
Yeah, so I'm Abigail. I'm just an environmental consultant, but I'm also a birder. I got involved with this project when I was finishing up my grad program at Drexel University. And at that time, my background was more in like studying birds. I've studied the parasites that infest grouse, who I guess are kind of neighbors to the wild horses that we're going to talk about here. So even though I was born a bird lover, through this work, I've been made a horse lover too. And basically, I just got involved because I really wanted to see how the social sciences could help me or help us more fully understand and protect the creatures that we love and the places that they call home.
Cool, thank you. So that's actually a really good segue, Abigail. Thanks for that. So as a team, we work on producing academic research and submit it for publication in academic journals. And just to kind of give you all a little bit of context in terms of how that works. This kind of research, when we do social sciences research, it is a conversation with other scholars generally. So we think about what have other scholars contributed to questions like, what does multi-species justice look like? What does it mean? What kinds of animals have we considered through this framework? Who else has done work that is even tangential or adjacent to some of the questions we're asking about horses, whether it's about wild dogs or mice, which is one of the other creatures we're going to mention today. And we kind of put this together in a puzzle and make an argument that we feel adds to the body of knowledge. In this case, we are adding to and essentially kind of creating a social sciences and humanities body of knowledge about wild horses that then other scholars will be able to call on as they build on our own work. When Christian just mentioned, when we started doing wild horse research together on a paper about the Assateague Island ponies, we realized through doing that paper that there's very little research that is published about wild horses that comes from the standpoint of Team Wild Horse, right? Most of the scholarly research is funded by the federal government and the Department of Interior and asks researchers to answer questions like, how can we make it so there are fewer wild horses? And tell us about the damage that wild horses do, right? It's very kind of anti-horse, and it is generally situated in the rangeland management literature. And our work challenges that. Our work is arguing that wild horses are worth protecting. They are knowable as individuals. And essentially, we are arguing that people like us, wild horse advocates, share a very meaningful sense of kinship with wild horses that is itself a really interesting source of knowledge about them. So that's to get you situated in the kind of work that we're doing and the direction we're coming from. Like, in short, we are building from an extremely thin pre-existing body of literature that exists on wild horses from the kind of social sciences, humanities point of view, and sort of making it so that other scholars can follow us and build on what we're doing. So this particular paper is our most recent paper. We have sort of thought about some of my wild horse photographer colleagues thought about the work that they're doing and how it contributes to something that is called multi-species justice. And you're going to recognize, I think any of us here are going to recognize the names of the photographers that we are citing here. And right now, we're presenting this paper to you. The paper we have submitted it to. What's the journal we've submitted it to?
So many journals. Environment and Planning E, Nature and Space.
Okay, top environmental politics journal. And right now we're waiting to hear the results of the peer review of that submission. In the meantime, I want to note that if there are any photographers here who we cite, we are going to be following up with you for specific permissions to use your photos in this paper when we get it published. But just know that our whole argument is for Team Wild Horse. Okay, so let's launch into the paper and the research itself. I'm going to give it over to Christian.
Okay, so let me introduce our...
Whoops, too far. Okay, there we go.
Yes,
that's
okay.
The one.
Yeah, so let's sort of introduce you all to our project of trying to connect wild horse photography to justice. So prohibited from lethal culling, the Bureau of Land Management has since the 1970s devised an apparatus for removing and warehousing wild horses that, though it minimizes killing, reduces most captured wild horses' circumstances to those of bare physical survival. At the same time, wild horses are increasingly vanishing from US public lands, despite their ostensible right to remain on federal land. In what follows, we briefly describe this increasingly exterminative context. We then set the stage for situating the work of wild horse advocacy photographers in the struggle for multi-species justice. We argue that visual storytelling by these advocates centers and empathizes with the lives of wild horses, and that in doing so, it invites critical reflection about the causes and consequences of unjust interspecies relations on Western rangelands. The images analyzed in our study were taken by photographers with large online audiences and whose work explicitly engages multi-species justice themes. These visual artists balance creative expression and advocacy in different ways, but they share a vision of Western rangelands inclusive of wild horses as flourishing landscapes. Each photographer is intimately familiar with particular herds and uses social media to share not only images, but also nuanced ideas about wild horses that challenge BLM's reductionist management framework, right, which sees horses as ecosystem destroyers and little else. We examined 45 images and captions by 16 photographers that highlight how wild horses inhabit and give meaning to their home places. The captions are as significant as the images. They frame photographs for online audiences and offer insights into the horses, the photographers' relationships with the horses, and critiques of public lands management. Our study shows how the visual arts can be a strategy to make places shared by different species more just for all their inhabitants. Together, we argue, the images and narratives we've examined position wild horses as subjects of justice because their lives hold meaning for themselves and for humans. This way of seeing non-human animals resonates with Dutch philosopher Eva Meyer's typology of more than human meaning-making. I'll say that again, more than human meaning-making, a typology that structures our own interpretation of how empathetic visual storytelling can advance multi-species justice.
All right.
Jen.
This one is me. All right, so a lot of you are going to be familiar with the kind of what we put forward on the slide, but I'm going to stipulate it anyway. So this is to give you a little bit of context in terms of federal wild horse management. The federal law compels Bureau of Land Management, which we shorten to BLM here, quote, to protect and manage wild horses and burros as components of the public lands in a manner that is designed to achieve and maintain a thriving natural ecological balance. The law further mandates that horses must be managed where they were found in 1971 when the Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burros Act was established. So the act essentially drew circles around where they found wild horses and said, this is Salt Wells Creek, this is Sandwash Basin, this is Green Mountain, et cetera, because horses were there. And it says the herds may not be relocated to other public lands, and they must be managed at, quote, the minimum feasible level. And what troubles us as advocates today, as you know, is BLM's determination for a growing number of herd management areas is that feasible level is 0, or it's close to 0. At least on paper, the Bureau is required to balance rangeland health with forage access for private livestock, grazing leaseholders, and the balance must include wildlife biodiversity, along with the healthy horse herds. But in practice, federal land management, where the wild horse, the herd management areas are concerned, is primarily responsive to extractive industries like livestock grazing, mining, et cetera. And it's ensuring that horses are replaced when they're removed. They're replaced not by diverse wildlife, but by more livestock, cattle and sheep. So you may also have observed that recently the pace of removals has intensified in the last several years in the face of ranching industry demands to maximize productivity of public lands grazing leases. The BLM employs 2 principal strategies for regulating horse population size: removal from the range following roundups, and deployment of contraception. In many cases, they combine these strategies. So we've seen, they'll remove most of a herd and then return back to the range a smaller number of stallions plus mares that have been treated with contraceptives, whether PZP or Gonacon. And currently there are tens of thousands of wild horses now living in holding corrals or BLM lease ranches. Where they are in holding corrals, this existence really has little regard for quality of life beyond just sort of basic keep them alive requirements.
All right, so before we get into the argument, I just want to briefly say a little bit about multi-species justice and what that is. In short, it's on one level, quite simply, extending our sort of human-centered theories of justice that political philosophers have been talking about for hundreds of years to non-humans, right? The question is, okay, what about animals? To the extent that we're becoming more aware of the capacities of mammals for sociality and to some extent moral reasoning and their sentience in sort of general terms, people are saying, well, historically we've simply excluded non-human beings from considerations of justice. That appears to no longer be tenable. So let's start thinking about what are the implications for both for the theories of justice, but also for those who are covered by them if we included non-human animals in how we think about justice.
Can I bump in here and say that a lot of this is driven by research in the last couple of decades that is showing that the idea of human exceptionalism, where cognitive capacity, emotional capacity, social capacity, language capacity is concerned, there's been a traditional thinking in science that humans are really special in terms of how we can use language, use tools, do moral reasoning, experience emotions like joy or grief. And those barriers are falling away with the research. We know that many non-human animals have quite similar inner experiences as humans, and therefore that is what is driving this idea of applying these traditionally human-centered political theories to animal communities. Thanks for that.
At the same time, it is also true that animals do not have human language, right? And we can't use human language to simply talk to them the way we would talk to most other humans who are capable of language. And so the argument then is that thinking about and thinking with animals requires maybe different strategies and different tools, and maybe ways of thinking and doing justice that may need to look a little bit different from the sort of human framework. And so people who write about multi-species justice have argued that efforts to promote justice for non-humans can benefit from a diverse range of communication and engagement practices, including various arts, storytelling, embodied communication, and emotion. And so that's sort of the point of departure for interest in visual storytelling about wild horses, to connect that to the struggle for multi-species justice. So we look at storytelling here not as a sort of neutral means of reporting about the world, sort of a neutral journalism method, perhaps, for visualizing the world as it is, but rather visual storytelling as a more than representational means to intervene in the world, right? To see is to change by rendering certain elements visible, sensible, and public. So things that people are barely aware that wild horses exist in North America, and most people know very little about their lives together, their family lives, their social ties, their body language, their communication habits, and so on. So wild horse advocate photography strives to sort of lay the groundwork to improve our capacity to see wild horses for who they are, right? Not as sort of interchangeable big brown bodies, but as individuals with lived experiences that unfold in their home places and within the context of their social relationships. That, we think, is an absolutely necessary inversion of the BLM strategy of sort of massifying horses, right? Where they're just interchangeable brown bodies. They count bodies. They say this many, this is too many, and then they sort of get carted off. So this sort of massification, you see that a lot in conservation biology and wildlife management, right? Where animals are just sort of reduced to populations, to numbers, and then people say this is overpopulation, this is underpopulation, and there's next to no concern or engagement with animals as sort of sentient beings with lives of their own. So this very different way of looking at wild horses contests these kinds of injustices that underlie how Western rangelands are being managed today. Empathetic visual storytelling, we argue, also sort of helps us prefigure more hopeful futures of living well together, right? If only more people started to see horses this way, the injustices that underlie contemporary management practices would no longer be justifiable. Visual storytelling also articulates a kind of interspecies ethic of care, right? That encompasses a kind of attentiveness toward individuals and attention to the exploitative economic and political structures, and a commitment to change those structures. So basically, we're sort of saying something in a sort of very complicated way, that advocacy photography can be political in ways that we're going to go into in a little bit more detail. Abigail.
All right. So we leaned on Eva Meyer's work, in which she was learning to see mice, for our framework of learning to see wild horses. And Meyer discusses this process of learning to see non-human animals for who they are as individuals and as social beings in terms of like two broad dimensions. So this way of seeing wild horses is typically ignored by rangeland management research on these animals. And we use these two dimensions to structure our interpretation of how wild horse advocate photographers seek to establish wild horses as subjects who are deserving of justice. First, non-human animals' existence as social and cultural creatures who are living these lives that are very meaningful to them. And second, how recognition of the richness of non-human meaning making by wild horses can transform how humans value their non-human lives. So, having brought home a group of mice rescued from a university laboratory, Meyer first practiced distinguishing between individual mice. She named them, and by learning to identify each mouse as an individual, she came to know their different and unique personalities, each one's habits, their relationship styles, and this required deliberate investments of her time and attention. But she had this very sustained engagement with the ways that the mice live their lives, and it enabled her, first, to establish the ways that the mice's relationships and interactions mattered to them. So, for example, she learned to read expressions of excitement and satisfaction and curiosity on the mice's faces. She became familiar with each mouse's preferences for what food they liked, how they liked to play, and she recognized their practices of how they cared and mourned for one another. Second, recognizing the abundance of the mice's meaning making individually and also socially profoundly altered how she came to value their lives. So there's both dimensions, what the mice's lives mean to themselves and what they mean to humans, that are involved in learning to see non-human animals in new ways. So in our paper, we discuss how advocate photographers make wild horses' innate value visible in terms of their physical resilience, social lives, their family bonds and friendships, and also their capacity for suffering. This first dimension is the foundation for the second. So transforming how humans value non-human lives. We consider advocacy photography's contributions to this transformation in terms of its receptiveness towards the charisma of non-human animals, non-human charisma's power of enchanting us, embracing an interspecies ethic of care that's rooted in kinship that we have with these creatures, and a condemnation of exterminative BLM management practices. So at this point, if anyone would just like to share their experiences encountering wild horses in the chat, please go ahead and start typing. In the meantime, an aspect of equine sociality that receives a lot of attention from advocate photographers is the centrality for horses of their family relationships. Photographers document dynamics like the lifelong companionship that some mares and their daughters establish, the mentorship that stallions often provide to the colts in their bands, who may or may not be their own sons. And images show how band members negotiate daily activities, like playing, staying alert to possible threats, or just working out who goes first when it's time to get a drink. It's not only the biological ties that are holding these bonds of affection and security for wild horses. There are found families, like the bands that bachelor stallions form, that are full of these very rich interpersonal dynamics that animate these horses' lives on the daily. In bachelor bands, photographers observe and report on practices of affection and friendship that are really opposite to the messaging about wild stallions as constantly in conflict with one another that are so common in like classic children's tales about wild horses. At this point, if anyone has witnessed a roundup and would like to share that experience in the chat, again, please feel free to do so. Documenting the suffering of wild horses that caught up in these BLM roundups is one of advocacy photography's more difficult tasks, which an example is what's on your screen right here. That's honestly hard to look at. Roundups are not just physically violent, but they also inflict psychological trauma on the horses. Photos taken at roundup sites clearly convey the distress of wild horses being set upon by helicopters, forced into crowded holding pens, and separated from their families and friends. In this case, this image is horses being driven like headfirst at full tilt into a ravine. So wild horses are rounded up indiscriminately, which puts the youngest and the most vulnerable horses at risk of injury, abandonment, and isolation from their mothers or other family members. So suffering, along with the other moments that we see of resilience, of affection, care, protectiveness, or combativeness that is captured in advocate photography, reveals how much their family bonds, or just their social relationships in general, really matter to wild horses.
Yeah, so the next couple of themes sort of address the second dimension, right? What do wild horses' lives mean to the human observers, which is rooted in the idea of non-human charisma, which the human animal studies scholar Jamie Lorimer established about 20 years ago. And in Lorimer's telling, he studied sort of conservation scientists in the field and how they related to the animals that they were sort of working with in the UK, of all places. So Lorimer draws attention to, in particular, what he calls the aesthetic dimension, so beauty, to make sense of how these scientists sort of make sense of the visual impact and affections triggered by encounters with free living animals in their sort of field work, right? They were sort of studying wild birds. And Lorimer observed that these encounters created moments of enchanting proximity to particular non-human animals that reconfigured the human attachments to these animals. So there's sort of a profound and important difference between, sitting in a biology class or even teaching a biology class and learning about wild animal biology and behavior, and then actually meeting and handling and being around and smelling and watching and sort of the full sort of sensory experience of being around these animals in the wild was a sort of profoundly altering experience for a lot of these scientists. And of course, as many of you know or would have experienced, I imagine, visitors to wild horse ranges testify to experiencing precisely these kinds of feelings of awe and wonder and peace and wonderment in the presence of wild horses, or just an experience of a kind of beauty that wouldn't exist, right, if you removed the horses from that landscape. Advocate photographers, at least in the images and captions that we examined, frequently emphasize wild horses' aesthetic charisma, right? In addition, though, to their corporeal beauty, most people find horses just physically sort of graceful. Observers also talk about horses' sort of graceful movements in space and time, right, on the land, just sort of animating the land in a way, particularly perhaps, if you sort of think of the often sort of austere grasslands, sort of semi-arid grasslands of the interior West in North America, horses is sort of, giving life to the land in a way that wouldn't be the case without their presence, right? Kinship, sort of another element or component of the second dimension of how non-human animal lives create meaning for humans. And part of the reason, arguably a big part of the reason why these moments of enchanting proximity that Lorimer describes, why these moments nurture, or these moments sort of nurture these relationships of kinship with non-human animals, and then often, in many cases, generate a sense of stewardship, right? A desire in humans to want to protect that land and to want to protect the animals that inhabit that land. Photographer Brenda Myers emphasizes the collective responsibility to take care of, quote, our public land, our horses, our elk, our antelope. Notably, these calls for valuing the land and the web of life it sustains don't focus on protecting species and habitats in the sort of abstract natural resources sense that ecologists and rangeland scientists talk about, but rather it's a more focused demand of respect for the embodied affective entanglements among horses and humans. For photographer Nightmare Brigade, as for most advocates, the debate about wild horses' nativeness, moreover, right, the BLM and other people like to call them sort of feral, which means unwanted or illegitimate. The whole nativeness debate is a distraction that undermines their central role as part of a thrown together multi-species American community. Carol Walker asserts a radically relational, kinship-based ethic of interspecies care in her caption of an image of the Salt Wells Creek stallion, Jack of Hearts. Quote, it's a bit of a longer quote, so bear with me. Walker, I remember being at a wild horse helicopter roundup in Wyoming several years ago, one of the many I've attended, when I became so upset about the number of horses being removed, many of whom I'd grown to know and love over the years. The wild horse and burro specialist, like the BLM employee, said to me, don't worry, Carol, in a few years, there will be many more horses again, as if they were all interchangeable, like cars or trucks or lawnmowers. No, those horses who were removed are unique, precious individuals. They have relationships with the other horses and their families. I have a relationship with those I've come to know, and they're irreplaceable. Separately, one of the other areas in wild horse advocacy photography where we find these expressions of kinship is in obituaries, right? When particularly well-known horses die for one reason or another, photographers and other people who visited the horses will flood social media with what are basically obituaries, right, to the horses. And so here's one around that Carol Walker created around Bubba, right, in Salt Lake when he died, a couple of years ago. Salt Wells Creek, right? And perhaps nothing conveys the existence of kinship relations more movingly than these obituaries, if you've ever taken the time to read them. Jen?
Yeah. All right, we're gonna wrap it up. Something funky about that slide somehow.
Okay, whoops, can we make it? I don't know what happened there.
Oh, sorry, our slide is a little funky right now, but I'm gonna just wrap up here. And so that we can go to a discussion. We are arguing in this project that wild horse advocacy photography of the kind that we've shown in some of our slides, it's not placeless and it's not apolitical. In fact, it is very political. It is very much about place. It emphasizes connections of horses to their home places. I want to say, like, a lot of, like, I bet a lot of us here, when I'm scrolling social media, like, especially when I'm looking for images to share for Wild Horse Photography Collective, I know where a photo was taken even before I read the caption like, that's obviously Oniki right now that I'm looking at, or that's obviously the Salt River, right? You know by the landscape, and you may even know an individual horse that you're seeing in an image, right? And so we are saying that this kind of advocacy photography emphasizes that individual horses are connected to really specific places, and it rejects the massification that we described earlier, in which a federal agency, one horse is the same as the other, and they sort of kind of doesn't matter who they are as individuals. The empathetic visual storytelling about actual animals who inhabit specific places, it facilitates a recognition of these non-human others as subjects of justice. In other words, sort of persons who deserve to live in justice. It invites a reflection about the really crude population control measures that reduce their vibrant presence on rangelands to that of just bare life in a holding facility. So we have shown how this kind of visual narration of wild horses, their physical resilience, their nuanced sociality, their capacity for suffering, among other kinds of factors, it reveals the richness of wild horses' lives and their lived experiences. And how visualizing their aesthetic charisma, their interspecies kinship, and by sort of highlighting the state-sanctioned scapegoating, it shapes the relationships that what we say in scholarly language, human-horse affective attachments, right? The relationship of kinship that we humans feel to the horses, and kind of helps to build our political commitment. In other words, the work that these photographers are doing helps people who are maybe less familiar with wild horses to see them as individuals who are worthy of our moral concern. The photographers we feature in the project, they prize context, the agency of the horses, relationality, vulnerability, and the horse's embodied existence, and how the photographers attend to the lived experience that they see of wild horse bands and families. And they reveal in their daily seasonal movements and routines, they see in horses practices of multi-species placemaking that would otherwise go unnoticed. So in our reading of this kind of photography as empathetic visual storytelling, the photographers are what we call restorying Western rangelands as flourishing landscapes of coexistence, instead of, in the BLM's telling, battlescapes of violence and destruction. And the photographers help us reimagine these rangelands as spaces capable of holding more convivial multi-species future. So they see a future of a sort of happy coexistence in a way that the federal agencies do not. And we thought that this dynamic that photographers support in this kind of work is important to, we felt it was really important to put down in the research as essentially a kind of a tool for advocacy. So that is, I want to kind of leave it there and open up to your questions and any discussion. We're kind of interested, I'm going to stop the screen share now. We're interested in hearing if anybody kind of pulled from the presentation does it point to any tools that you might use, for example? We gave you perhaps a couple of new concepts, the idea of massification. When BLM employees talk about horses as all being, they're kind of all interchangeable and the same, right? That is called massification. Another term we use, multi-species justice, sort of the idea that horses deserve to be managed and treated. How would you describe it? Sort of where multi-species justice.
Well, not. I mean, I think the idea is, right, if you can sort of reframe wild horses as sentient, intelligent beings with family ties and lives and communication, as opposed to sort of at best livestock, it becomes much harder to justify this kind of massification, detention, and basically kind of life imprisonment. Now we know that this barely works for humans, right? Which is obviously an ongoing struggle on all levels. On the other hand, it never works without that, right? Justice seems to be inseparable from seeing beings that are subject to justice as sort of fully human, right? And obviously, we're not saying that horses are humans. We are saying something like horses are persons, right? I mean, there are non-human persons, and non-human personhood is perhaps a way to establish sort of a sense of justice around treatment and management, and what can be done and what can't be done.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm gonna stop running my mouth and see if anybody has questions or comments, and then we'll go to the chat comments.
Isabella wants to know, have you considered, or possibly you may have done and she's not aware, an online virtual photojournalism storytelling exhibition along the line of We Animals did last year with photographer Bogna Witowska's The Unseen Animals of Central Asia?
I mean, we haven't.
But you do Wild Horse Collective.
In a certain way, the Wild Horse Photography Collective kind of curates in what may be a similar way, but I think as a research team, that's not a thing that we have really considered yet, I guess.
No, I think we have an idea for a follow-up project that we want to discuss with some of the wild horse photographers, and something along those lines may be a result of that. Like, I think it'd be really interesting to put together a collective project around how, we showed Carol Walker's project, right? The birth of the foal in not Salt Lake, what's the other one?
McCullough Peaks.
McCullough Peaks, right? The sort of the gathering of the rest of the family around the newborn foal. This kind of, it's a kind of family ritual that happens when foals are born. And some herds more than others, apparently. And so we know that wild horse photographers have access to all kinds of really interesting information about the lives of wild horses that nobody really studies particularly systematically, because again, a lot of the funded research is just about how to remove them and management and sort of population management. It's less about learning about their lives. And so I could certainly think that there'd be space for a collective sort of exhibit by wild horse photographers as a way to sort of teach publics more about the lives of wild horses, as in our sort of in the way that we're trying to do in this paper.
Yeah.
Sheila says, great premise. The follower photographers are essential to documenting the interspecies discussion. Your work will emphasize how important their work is. We need a funding source for them. It will take an interspecies collaboration.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, a lot of people fund their own. I mean, people sometimes move close to herd areas, right, to be able to sort of work there. I know that's the case with at least one photographer I know of. But yeah, most of it is self-funded, and some of the better known photographers are able to sell their work. Although that's always, it's very hard to do that for most people in a sort of sustainable way. But yeah, I mean, maybe we'll apply for some grants, see what happens. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, thanks.
So I have a question for you guys. We started this weekend off with Eric Mulvar from Western Watersheds Projects, and he gave a lot of really great information in his presentation, a lot of good scientific information. And some of the questions that came out, because of course he's not a wild horse. They don't necessarily advocate for wild horses. But so how do we get more wild horse biologists, more people like you doing papers, peer reviewed papers that will help support our advocacy? Do you have any thoughts or ideas on that? I mean, it's great to see Abigail here with you guys. But how do we
It's
get more?
really it's really tough, right? So Chad Hansen talks about this in his book, Land of Awe, where he summarizes this very nicely. Sort of wild horses fall through the cracks, right? So there's two fields that would be sort of interested in them, right? The ecologists and wildlife biologists, conservation people should be interested, but aren't, because wild horses are sort of, they're considered feral, not truly wild, right? They're not the sort of the native, quote unquote, native species that sort of real biologists study and that deserve protection. So they're not particularly interested. And then the horse research that does exist is primarily about domestic horses, right? And their training and their care and medicine and all of those things. But, they don't study wild horses. They're sort of primarily interested in the sort of how humans use horses and how to treat them well. And, there's a lot of research on sort of captive horse welfare. And veterinary medicine, but no research on sort of wild horses. And so that's sort of the problem in a way, right? That feral animals, or animals that are sort of considered, feral in the sense of, formally domesticated, now wild. If you sort of think of, parrots in London, or, animals where they don't where they haven't sort of evolved, that nobody really studies them. So there is some interest in sort of our field of, human animal studies or critical animal studies, where geographers primarily are interested in sort of space and how animals move through space, inhabit space, new kinds of spaces. And there's all kinds of fun research around sort of quote unquote feral animal species in cities and other spaces. So there's some research going on there, but it's not, it's ignored by ecologists, and it's ignored by the sort of funding agencies that traditionally fund wildlife research.
Yeah, there are really important conceptual boundaries around which animals deserve studying, and therefore which deserve funding for the studying. And I mean, Abigail, I'm sure you could speak to this too, since your training has come out of was sort of this, you were immersed in field ecology, but that just really inhibits the funding available to researchers, right? And therefore inhibits what we all can learn about animals like this. And one of the kind of fun things about being social scientists is that we can consciously step around those kinds of conceptual barriers and ask what does make wild horses more really interesting, or what does make a wild pig roaming around the city of Hong Kong really interesting, right? And so we're not so much bound by those kinds of conceptual boundaries. Of course, we don't get any research funding for our work. So we can't employ like grad students and things like that. But that's the downside of that, of our kind of ability to kind of do our research outside of those barriers.
I was gonna say that there's kind of an alternate reality out there where maybe I never took a class with Christian and I never met Jen, and all of my training basically would have probably led me to think about horses in the same way that these people who are producing research for BLM do, right? It's, all about numbers, all about conserving populations, and to kind of think about individuals or their personalities or relationships, which is totally not part of the way that I was basically trained. And I think for me personally, the kind of conceptual jump off point to be able to get interested in stuff like this with wild horses was kind of being aware of the pitfalls of how mainstream science also treats people poorly too, like minority groups of people or whatever, where we're not nearly as equipped as I've been led to believe to kind of provide some groups of people justice. And kind of starting off there, then I'm able to understand how that also applies to other animals, to wild horses, etc. But yeah, I'm lucky I ended up where I was.
Well, I think that's why, to some extent, I think the justice frame is sort of promising, right? Because when the concern is sort of, I mean, it's hard, it's well, I mean, I'm going to grandstand here. I was going to say it's pretty hard to argue against justice, but apparently that's no longer the case. But for most people, most of the time, it's very hard to argue in favor of an unjust system. And so rather than the focus on species, right, human or not human, and who's in, who's out, the broader framing of justice, particularly reframing it in terms of multi-species justice or justice for all life, or something that's beyond just only humans, makes it maybe a little bit easier to talk about injustices when non-human animals are at the receiving end in the way that Abigail just articulated.
I see a comment about Ashley Avis's work. Yeah, agree. I hope everyone has seen her film about wild horses. And that's exactly the kind of tool that we think can be really useful in advocacy, just kind of connecting, getting audiences, humans, to connect very emotionally with horses is extremely powerful. Like, think about how much harder it is in the 21st century to abuse a dog. Like, why is that hard? It's because through our life with dogs, and sort of, as we've been keeping dogs as pets, like, I don't know many people who have dogs as pets who won't say, like, this dog's personality is different from that dog's personality, and they see how dogs have emotional lives and have communication abilities, right? And so we kind of see dogs as as we would say in our work, as kin, right? And that emotional connection that humans have with dogs is protective for dogs. It doesn't mean every dog is protected, right? But there are laws against abusing pet animals, right? And I think it's a good comparison. The kind of we argue in our research that what wild horse advocates are doing is essentially enable people to understand wild horses in a kind of a similar way, to see them as quirky individuals who all have a kind of different personalities. All of you know this, right? If you spent time with wild horses, who care for their families, right? Who feel grief when they are separated from their families, right? When you can see animals in this almost sort of in this way that we humans share, the sort of all the emotional kinds of experiences that we all have in common, then it becomes easier to protect them, if that makes sense. Other questions, comments, feedback?
So how do we get the BLM or the federal government to look at what the research you guys are doing and take it into consideration?
Well,
I know, like,
yeah.
we
Sorry,
talked
Chris.
about that a little bit beforehand. Like, even like the Theodore Roosevelt federal legislation just calls for 150 horses to be in the park. And that's what I'm afraid of, exactly what you guys were saying. As long as there's 150 of some kind of horse in the park, it's fine, with no regard for the individual horses, the genetics that help them survive in the Badlands of North Dakota. So how do we change that narrative?
Classic example of massification. Is it not true that federal employees in these agencies are required to inform their work with published research, right?
Sure. I mean, there's not a lot of vetting on what they read and so on. So, I mean, they're obviously free to ignore our work. One parallel, it's a sort of a little bit of it's a double-edged sword in a way, right? But hunting, right? Sort of hunting of large mammals in particular. This is sort of horrible, right? Like elephants, elk, and so on. There's been a little bit of a change of thinking, right? Where in the there's sort of a here and there you can sort of see a shift in emphasis on which and sort of around age, and which sort of if you think of bull elk, where people pay a guy its own money to go sort of shoot a bull elk in Wyoming or whatever, and the recognition, right, that older animals, at least some older animals, are sort of vital for the thriving and longevity and survival of the herd in the winter, because they sort of remember, where they can find grass under the snow, or during drought, they might remember from earlier in their lives where still to find water. There's sort of a growing awareness that perhaps hunters maybe ought to be killing very old animals, right? Or to some extent, animals that are sort of beyond their sort of prime of life, or maybe some slightly younger animals, instead of just always going for the, for sort of the bull elk in the sort of their prime. I mean, it's not a fully worked out example, and it's you only start to see a little bit of here and there going on. But the point I'm trying to make is that to the extent that there is now better research and better knowledge about the sort of herd dynamics and which animals matter, and that you need to have a sort of healthy kind of demographic mix to enable the herd's survival and thriving, is interesting, right? It's the kind of argument that might resonate with a management agency, right? To sort of say, well, okay, we still have to remove some animals, but let's make sure that we don't sort of do a mass removal, but maybe a little bit more targeted or informed by science. I mean, that's not what we're arguing for, but that's would be sort of an example where perhaps research and management can sort of meet.
And there's a couple of dynamics happening, right? So, I mean, I do know that the Wild Horse and Burro program has seen our papers, because I've been in touch with, I forget the research manager, Paul something.
Yeah.
I know his eyeballs have been on our papers. Whether he's taken them seriously is another thing. But I think a couple of things are happening. Abigail talked about the training that scientists go through, that there's, human animal studies folks are hassling the field ecologists to think more about individual animals' lives and not to massify them. Like, if that can be accomplished, then the quality of the research about wild horses and other wildlife will change, right?
Yeah.
And that knowledge filters up to federal agencies. The other important dynamic is who's in the federal agencies, right? Right now, we're seeing a dismantling of expertise and, a sort of just kind of refocusing the purposes of agencies during this particular administration onto like what's going to make the rich guys richer, right? I mean, I feel like an ideal scenario is we value federal agencies and expertise in those agencies, and think about who gets to have those jobs, right? And how are they getting trained? And a lot of this comes down to like, how are we training professionals?
Yeah.
To train scientists to produce research that acknowledges and values the individuality of animals, their sociality, et cetera, but also training federal agency workers to take that research seriously. Does that make sense? Like these sort of,
it does. I mean,
when these two dynamics can come together, then I think things get better for wild horses.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in our university, students like Abigail, who are doing environmental science there now, are going to take a multi-species justice class, right, with Professor Hunold, and they're going to hear this other perspective that they're not getting from their field ecology scientist teachers for the most part. So, I mean, I study social movements for a living, and there's good news and bad news, and I mean lots of bad news, but good news is, to the extent that it exists, that change like this takes usually a very long time. decades or longer, right? As sort of generations of expertise move through the system, and younger generations learn to do things differently. Conservation, I mean, forget wild horses, conservation science generally is sort of undergoing a little bit of a transformation because, you know, so many younger people who are going into the field just aren't super happy about constantly having to kill, you know, hundreds, thousands of animals for the sake of, you know, they're not truly native, or they're considered invasive or whatever, you know, and it's traumatizing, and people leave the field sometimes very quickly. I mean, the attrition rate is sort of not unlike that of nurses in healthcare settings, right? It's a traumatizing job. And so, yeah, training professionals, diversifying sort of sources of knowledge that goes into people's training like this.
And valuing expertise
Yeah.
in and valuing federal agencies, really, right? Because those can be the bulwark against
Sure.
completely rapacious capture by industry. That's a long answer, Chris.
Well, thank you. Abigail, I have a question for you, because you're new to this, and like you said, had you not met Jen and Christian, things would have been different, or you would have had a different view. So how do we reach the younger generation for wild horse advocacy, and what do you see in advocacy that we could be doing differently from your perspective for someone new and in a younger generation?
Okay.
As
Can you
you're the
repeat that?
Spokesperson for the youth.
Curious, you know, how do we get to your younger generation? Like, had you not met Jen and Christian, like you said, you would have had a different perspective on wild
Sure.
horse advocacy. But so, what do you see that, like, maybe we're looking for ways to think outside the box? That's part of it. So, what do you see that, like, you know, areas where we can improve in wild horse advocacy, and how can we appeal to a younger generation like you guys?
Sure. I think there's a lot of people around my age group who are kind of getting into, maybe I'll just sort of say, like, I'm not even talking like academically, but like birding has become like a trend. Um, they're like going to national parks has like become kind of a trendy thing to do in some ways. And there's some kind of like, there are people out there who are kind of in ways monetizing it that might be a little bit weird, but I think there is like kind of a consensus of like people need to go touch grass. People need to be outside. Like there's definitely like a sense of malaise and doom that people my age have about like these screens that we're looking at all the time. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity there for that to go in a bunch of different directions. Um, I mean, the fact that so many of these photographers have social media presence, that would maybe get eyes on it, I think is a great place to start. Um, I think, I mean, it sounds like there's already like a level of tourism dedicated to this that's there. Um, but I really feel like if I don't know, it's some sort of like social media campaign, I think would be maybe very beneficial because I've seen that happen for other groups of concern. Um, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Andrea said in 2023, University of California, Santa Fe definitely proved in their paleontology department that wild horses are native, evolving in North America, and going so far to say that there would be no horses worldwide today if North America never existed.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, yeah, I mean, Santa Cruz, I assume we mean, yeah. Who's our colleague who's the paleontologist? I was just traveling for a month. I just lost everything from my brain. Anyways,
Like Drexel?
no, in the wild horse world. Chris, who is our paleontologist friend? And, yeah, horses emerged as creatures about this tall in North America, and eventually grew to as tall as we know them to adapt to grasslands life as the globe changed. And Ross, thank you, Sheila. And they crossed Beringia to arrive in East Asia and kind of populated the world from there in lots of different forms, like sort of became wild asses. They became the takis of Mongolia, and eventually, of course, the sort of shape of horse that we know today. Really super interesting paleontological history. One of the other interesting things that we've learned was that it's kind of assumed that the equus, I forget the second part of the Latin name, but the sort of the form of horse just before it became modern equus, was assumed that they kind of went regionally extinct in North America, like 15,000 years ago?
Yeah.
But some evidence from the Yukon has them present up to 5,000 years. So horses kind of persisted in North America for a little bit longer than some of the existing scholarship has believed. In our argument in human animal studies, that the idea of whether they're native doesn't matter. Like in our argument, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? In the way a lot of sort of field ecology wants to kind of preserve these sort of pure landscapes and ecosystems, right? And we think that it is like the kind of ecosystems that we are looking at today are worth valuing and studying for who's in them now, right? It doesn't, like, we think horses, if horses never evolved in North America, we would still care about them, right? And so while in human animal studies, in that question of whether or not they're native, it's interesting, but we think that all animals are worthy of our concern, right? And deserve justice, whether, just like people, just like humans, that you are deserving of justice no matter where you are in the globe.
And that's something that Ross McPhee said in a conversation that we had. Like, at what point do we give horses their green card, right? And quit arguing over it was only this long or it's been that long or whatever.
Absolutely.
When do we just give them a green card and just say, hey,
I love that way of thinking of it. Doesn't it matter to the BLM decision makers from Andrea? I mean, no. I think that they are considered non-native is, the easy argument for removals.
Yeah. Of course, that doesn't stop, in other contexts, the nativeness decision doesn't protect animals, right?
Think about coyotes.
Yeah, so one of the other areas of research that I'm engaged in is to study sort of the politics of urban wildlife. And if you think about a place like Miami, right, where you have Miami, sort of the urban megalopolis of Miami, abutting the Everglades National Park, inside the park, if you're a native animal, you are sort of absolutely protected from hunting and killing and so on. That same animal across the border in Miami-Dade County is subject to sort of trapping, poisoning, shooting, whatever. It's the same native animal, but is now under the sort of urban framework seen as a nuisance, a pest, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a property owner and you're annoyed at the raccoon or coyote or whatever, right, you call a wildlife removal company and they solve your problem. So, the nativeness argument sort of gets deployed very kind of instrumentally, right? Sort of, it offers animals a lot less protection than we sometimes sort of think it does. And so it's often a kind of, in this case, in the case of wild horses, it's clearly an argument that agencies use to make horses more removable, right? More easily removable.
Yeah. Coyotes are native and millions of them are killed every year. And it doesn't protect them. Eric also said, if you're born in the wild to parents that live wild, you're not feral. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that works for me.
Yeah. I mean, we also think of the word feral as a very political term that does not really have a lot of biological meaning. In the way it's used, it's calling somebody, it's like calling a human an illegal, right? when you refer to a human as an illegal, it dehumanizes and it invites and, you know, sort of opens the door to injustice, right? Yeah, Sheila, and like what so Farrell does the same political work as the way we talk about humans being illegal. We do not care for it. Any other questions or comments? And does anybody have stories they want to share about some of the dynamics that we described around animal social dynamics, or some of the other things we saw, the sort of charisma?
I think someone said about horses coming through their yard in one of the chat comments.
Okay. Cool.
Well, great.
It has been
Well,
a pleasure.
thank you guys so much for doing this and for all the work that you do, not just for this paper, but I know you guys have written a bunch of other papers. Is there a way that people can get in touch with you or look at your works?
Yeah, if you let's see, I should have had this link ready, but ResearchGate is like social media for academic researchers, like ResearchGate, all one word, right? So if you Google the terms Jen Britton and ResearchGate or Christian Hunold and ResearchGate, you'll find all our stuff.
Yep. But we list the photographers. Well, not yet, because we haven't, the paper is sort of at a manuscript stage, and we haven't, so if and when we get positive feedback from the journal, we'll then contact the photographers to say, hey, we're talking about your work. Is it okay to use your image in the publication? Because we'll need copyright permission. So at the moment, I think we probably don't want to share this publicly.
Yeah.
But you know, Carol Walker, Scott Wilson,
Sandy
Sisti,
a lot of the usual suspects.
Yeah.
And Wild Horse Photography Collective is a great place to see different.
Yeah, Photography Collective. Follow us, and at such time as we do get this thing published, we'll share in the Wild Horse world.
Yep.
So hopefully you all get to read it, but you'll be able to see. I saw the presentation before it was a paper.
That's
right. Well, thank you, and thank you guys again for all your work and for your continued, you know, scientific fight for the wild horses. It's really important. So thank you. And thank you everyone for being here, and we'll be back at 3 o'clock. Mary is going to do a presentation on the Devil's Garden wild horses and give us an update. So thank you again, and I'll see everybody in a little bit.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.